Well, as you can see, the owner opted to have me rebuild it as it was originally, only without the noise. He wanted the 50s look. I did explain that the 60s wiring with the resistors moved to the input jacks was a better circuit, which is one of the reasons Fender moved to it, but he wanted everything vintage for the 50s, so okay, I can do that. Let me get this to focus and I'll show you where the problem is. All right, this red wire, we'll move this yellow wire to the side. This red wire is the B+ connection, which feeds those plate resistors. This is where these two grid stopper resistors go, and then it goes to the tube, and then this one here. Do you see that discoloration on the board? Like a dark gray puddle, and it joins the three in that area. That's where the leakage is coming. So I'm going to get all this solder out and disconnect everything and really soak this side of the board and try to drive all that out. I'm going to clean up a lot of the solder and flux and yuck that's pooled up on this side as well. These are the things you don't see until you get in, and some puddles and stuff, that's almost unavoidable, but I can minimize that and clean all that up and show you the after, and hopefully when I put this back together those problems will be gone. As far as the other problem with the amp not sounding great at high gain, I noticed that when I took it apart that most of the pots weren't fully tight, the nuts weren't fully tight, and as these pots make their grounds to chassis, if that chassis connection is not good, the ground is not good. So these things will all be addressed as I put it back together. But excuse me, I've got some cleaning to do. All right, everything is clean now. All that residue is gone. Time to button it back up, resolder these things, and see if the tweed disease has been abated. All right, all put back together. Can't tell that it was ever taken apart, though all these solder joints were totally redone. Let's fire it up and see where we're at and see if that DC is gone. Well, I'm disgusted to report that while it did improve it, it did not eliminate it. I'm debating whether to do another round of isopropyl and heat using a heat gun. It's down to 88 millivolts on input channel 2 and 100 millivolts on channel 1. And so it's almost unnoticeable, but it is there. And very possibly would grow worse, assuming the amp is used in humid conditions. And as I told the owner before I did this, there's no guarantee that it won't return in 10 months, a year, 5 years. You know, there's just no guarantee. And it's because of this fiberboard. Now, this fiberboard has a smell when heated as if there's a very slight wax coating. Other than that, it's pretty much bone stock, heavy duty cardboard. The stuff Fender used was actually the stuff that was used to line suitcases back in the day. Just a not very high quality stiff cardboard with some eyelets that were actually just eyelets for clothing design, crimped on there. So it was a bad design really in the 50s, and having the grid stoppers on the board like this is very problematic, just mostly because of the small space between this B+ node and the input for here, though that is affecting over here as well. So let me try to heat that entire area up some more, kind of gently bake it and see if I can get that voltage even lower. Much better to move the grid stoppers off the board and put them at the tube socket. But if the owner wants it 50s, let me see if I can get it to the 50s. Well, it's decreasing, but it's not gone. I'm going to put this amp to the side, power it on with a dummy load, and let it just kind of do its thing for a while and see if as the rest of the isopropyl evaporates out of the board, whether it becomes stable or not. I'm going to put this to the side and work on some other things. This is frustrating because it is a known problem in the design that people who build replicas, let's call it a replica, there are people who copy, let's be nice and say this is a replica, repeat the mistakes of the originals, and they have the symptoms of the originals. And the fix is so simple, and it's just to say, Fender sure screwed that up on the 50s ones. Let's go and wire this like they did in the 60s once they realized how to build amps better. But if the owner wants it 50s, let's see what I can do. All right, 2 hours of just being on later. The voltage is down to 30 millivolts on channel 2 and just under 80 millivolts on channel 1. I'm gonna let it run a few more hours and see if it gets even better. It takes a while for the last of the moisture to leave. So there's almost no noise at all on the volume pot of the guitar. And what this whole process has done is that there was moisture, i.e. water, in the board. And I soaked this area with isopropyl, and as the isopropyl soaks in, it displaces the water in the board. And then I heated things up, both when I was resoldering and because the heat of the soldering iron helped a lot. Before I even added more solder, I heated up the eyelets a lot, and I could see the isopropyl just kind of dissipate in big rings around the eyelets. And that drives out the water moisture. But because I had literally soaked this cardboard with the alcohol, it takes a while for all of it to come out. And that part of the board just doesn't get that hot. It takes some time. But I think this is going to be good. Compare that to earlier, where there was just terrible every time I touched the volume pot on the guitar. So I think I might have made it go away. As I told the owner, it can come back. This board material is just kind of, frankly terrible. And there's a reason that I use the fiberglass boards in my own builds. Let me confirm that all the DC is off of those coupling caps. Gone. Still a tiny bit there, about 60 millivolts. And a lot of Fenders, someone will measure that and assume that the cap itself is leaking, and will change that out. That is not the case with these Jupiters, and it's rarely the case with the blue Ajax caps from the 60s. What happens on those amps, again, is the same thing that's happened here. The board absorbs moisture. You remove the old Ajax cap, you put in an orange drop. At the end of the process, that DC is gone. You think that it was a bad cap and you did the right thing putting in the orange drop. It was really just heating up the board through the act of desoldering and resoldering that cured it, and there was nothing wrong with that cap to begin with. So when you see a Fender come in from the 60s and it's just full of orange drops or whatever, usually that means that someone did the wrong thing for the right reasons, if that makes sense. The reasons were actually wrong too. They did the wrong thing for the wrong reasons, thinking they were doing a good thing. It's very rare to find an actual bad leaking blue Ajax cap, except for the 20 nanofarad 400 volts on the outputs of like an AB165 Bassman. That's a place they should have used 630 volt caps, and those can become leaky. the red and yellow Astrons from the 50s and very early 60s become leaky all the time, and I replaced them on site. These red Jupiters are copies of those red Astrons, but these Jupiters aren't leaking. So real quick, I'm going to see what this thing sounds like turned up now that we've got the proper bias there. It's not 100% where I want it to be, but it is so close as to be negligible. So we're just going to turn this channel way up and telecast her. Turn the treble down a little bit, the bass up a little bit, the presence down a little bit. Channel. I need to call the owner, see what guitars he's using and what kinds of sounds he's after, to make sure that I'm not going in the wrong direction. So this so far is sounding really good. Remember, this has just been a Telecaster, so you've just heard the neck. Before that was bridge. I need to go through here and play pretty much every note to make sure there's not any area of ghosting. So far, it's sounding pretty healthy. So, pending talking to the owner as far as what sounds he's really trying to get and what pickups and guitar he's using, I'll revisit this to make sure that everything's great. But I'm not hearing that tearing paper at all now. I mean, I can make it bright if I want. That was on the brighter channel, that last bit of stuff. You know, I can make it brighter, but that tearing paper is not there. And I do hear artifacts of the cathode phase inverter, but the kind of artifacts that you want in an amp like this that make it sound like what it's supposed to be. It's got some TAD 6L6s. They're very healthy. It's got a new old stock or just older 5U4G, and it's got 3 RCA 12AX7s. I do prefer this amp with the AY in V1. I find it changes the feel and the compression aspect. And the owner said that he runs it both ways, and he's got a whole bunch of tubes. So I'm not going to worry too much about that as long as the amp is getting the sounds that he's after. If I don't know what the owner is going to want, but I've played enough tweed Fenders to know that this is pretty much what it's supposed to sound like now that V1 is biasing correctly. And I think I'm about to take my wife out to dinner, and I'm going to leave this running, and measure the voltage when I get back. Between this little snippet you've just heard and the previous part of this video was like two and a half hours. I wasn't just sitting around twiddling my thumbs building the guy for those 2.5 hours. I actually worked on 2 other amps while this was just sitting and kind of self-baking. I don't put every amp that I work on the channel. There's no time for that. I try to do the interesting ones and the ones with unusual problems, or the ones that, hey, you know, who can't relate to a deluxe reverb, and these days to a blues junior, etc., etc. So try to balance out the, you know, esoterica from the 50s and 60s, the really valuable stuff with everyday stuff, and then just things that are interesting. All right, real quick follow-up. I got back from dinner, and it's been running this whole time, about 2 hours now, and the grid of each tube, each triode has dropped even further. There's now about 28 millivolts here, about 33 millivolts here. Remember, this was like 300 millivolts and 700 millivolts earlier. So it's a huge decrease. I'm hoping that as the amp runs a little bit more, it'll drop even further. We will find out. There are limitations to this topology and this layout and this board material. There's a reason Fender changed the design and moved the grid stoppers to the input jacks on later amps. It is the better method. But I will talk to the owner and find out what pickups he's using, what sounds he's chasing, see how close we are to realizing the right sound for this amp, and see where we're at that point. Real quick, someone asked in a comment in the previous video on this amp that he was confused because I said there should be no voltage present on the grid. And he quite rightly said, wait, I thought there had to be voltage on the grid for amplification to occur. And he's right, and I'm right. I should have been a little more clear in the previous video, so I will explain here. This is an AC coupled, cathode biased gain stage. This is a voltage amplifier stage. Let's see if I can get the full mouthful out there. Cathode biased, AC coupled, voltage amplified triode stage. And there are 3 of them in a row in this amp, and some other things happen, but for right now we're focused on these 2 stages here. And while there must be AC voltage present at the grid for amplification to occur, and that AC voltage comes from our pickup in this case. You heard it with a Telecaster, but anything would generate a AC signal from a keyboard to a guitar suits our needs. That AC comes in on the grid, and there is DC on the plate and DC on the cathode, and because of the ratios of everything and the voltages used and the tube type used, there should be an expected amplification factor. Let's say that it's 70. So we would expect incoming AC to be amplified by 70 times, a gain factor of 70. So that AC coming in kind of piggybacks on the DC going from the cathode and the grid up to the plate, and then comes out of the plate 70 times louder. So we had 70 volts AC here. Then we would have, we had 1 volt AC here on the grid. We would then have 70 volts AC here on the plate, but it would be mixed in with that 200 and something volts DC, and then goes to this coupling cap, which blocks the DC and just lets that 70 volts out. So we have 1 volt AC in, 70 volts AC out for this triode. And that's the goal. So AC voltage in, DC plate, DC cathode, that's what you want. You do not want any DC voltage on an AC coupled gain stage. That just throws the bias off. That's the problem that we were experiencing at the beginning of this. Aside from the noise on the volume pots, it just throws the behavior of the tube out the window. Now, that is a very dumbed down, simplified explanation of how this triode voltage amplifier works. And what's the best way to put this? YouTube videos are great for, hey, here's a concept, and for more information on that concept, see this. It is not a great format to give you actual education in 15-minute chunks. Neither do I have the time to do that kind of thing. So if you want to know more about this, or if someone's furiously beginning a, well, actually, comment, stop, and look at the link in the description of this video. I've given a link to Merlin Blinco's excellent chapter on this very subject, where he goes into greater depth on all this. And he's got information on all kinds of circuits which are useful for us: AC coupled cathode followers, DC coupled cathode followers, different kinds of phase inverters, all kinds of stuff. But it starts with the basics of just how a triode, a cathode biased triode works, because that's the most common stage you will encounter in an amplifier. And that's where this one was falling down on its face. So I strongly recommend that you read the chapter if you're interested in guitar amps, both as a musician or as someone who wants to get into building or even designing. If you want to know what you're building and why the person who's designed or using made those choices, you have to do the reading. You have to do the math. I'm sorry, there's no way around it. But at the end of the day, you get to make cool sounds like this thing makes. So you got that going for you, which is nice.